Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to document designated sites that talks about the struggle of freedom as well as the accomplishments of the Black and African American communities. Today, we have with us two people from the Connecticut Landmarks, Lynette Fisher, who is the site administrator at Joshua Hempsted in the southeast corner in New London. And she, along with Nicole Thomas, will talk about the historic district as well as the Joshua Hempsted House and Adam Jackson. Lynette, welcome.
Thank you, Tammy. It's nice to see you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynette Fisher, as Tammy said. It's lovely to be joining all of you here today. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. Tammy, we appreciate you having us here for the Freedom Trail conversation this afternoon. As Tammy mentioned, I'm the site administrator for the Hempsted Houses, which is part of the Connecticut Landmark Southeast region. In addition to the Hempsted Houses, Nicole and I manage two additional Connecticut Landmarks historic properties, one of which is the Amasi Day House in Moodus, which was built in 1816 by Julius Chapman. The Amasi Day House is an excellent example of federal-style architecture, and it gives visitors the opportunity to see how the Industrial Revolution changed the American view of work and recreation. We also have the Palmer Warner House that was built in 1738 by the Warner family and bought in 1936 by preservation architect Frederick Palmer, who later resided in the home with his partner Howard Metzger. Connecticut Landmarks is currently cataloging collections, researching and planning interpretive material for future operations at Palmer Warner as an inclusive historical museum that provides a safe setting to share multiple viewpoints and ideas. Please feel free to reach out to either me or Nicole if you have questions about any of the other houses in our region. But today we're focusing on the Hempsted Houses and in particular the story of Adam Jackson. Adam, in large part, is the centerpiece of many of the conversations we have during our tours because his story shines a very bright light on how our wants and needs can affect the lives of those around us and is relevant even today. Because of Adam's forced labor, Joshua the diarist was able to advance in civil leadership and build generational wealth that would not have been possible without Adam's skills and talents, right? So this theme helps us at Hempsted to encourage conversations that get people to a place where they can hopefully connect truthful experiences of the enslaved to issues that are still present in today's society. Along with other documented stories, we can help facilitate working through the idea of civic-minded action, despite sometimes having circumstances that can make it a little difficult to make taking action a little difficult. So, for example, when we compare Stephen Hempsted, who was a Revolutionary War hero who moved to Missouri to join slaveholding family members and then ends up owning 5 slaves himself, to Mary Hempsted Bowles, who publicly resigned from the Second Congregational Church when the pastor refused to renounce slavery, we can kind of help ignite thought-provoking conversations that we hope inspire continued dialogue and hopefully move visitors to take action in their own community. The Hempsted neighborhood has historically been a place of activism and change, initially developed in the 19th century from the subdivision of lands held by the Hempsted and Holt families. Abolitionists eventually developed it to provide housing for members for the free Black community. Adam Jackson and the Hempsted neighborhood are important pieces of the New London community and the Connecticut Freedom Trail. And my colleague Nicole has put together a really great presentation that will delve a little deeper into the history to help you better understand the importance of Adam and the part he played in the Hempsted family and the Hempsted neighborhood itself. In my opinion, Nicole is a very eloquent voice of Adam Jackson and has played a significant role in raising awareness of not only his story and that of many other enslaved New Londoners, but also the Connecticut Freedom Trail. She has an incredible amount of knowledge about all of the things that I briefly touched on here and so many more. And with that, I will pass it over to Tammy to introduce Nicole and get her started with her presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lynette. Now, up next will be Nicole Thomas. For nearly 20 years, she has been studying the local history of New London. And for 4 years, she was an interpreter at the Hempsted House. And now she takes on the role as the assistant site administrator. And she is also a very prominent person in the setting up of the Black Heritage Trail there in New London. So, Nicole, please welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you. As previously mentioned, my name is Nicole Thomas. So today we're going to talk a little bit about colonial Connecticut, the story of the Hempsteads in New London, and the legacy and story of Adam Jackson and the Jackson family. So in talking about the Jackson family, we really can't get to the core of how we find out about Adam Jackson and his family without first discussing the Hempsteads and their beginnings here in New London. We're also going to talk a little bit, just really briefly, about a religious sect called the Rogerines and how they play a very large part in the storytelling here, as they were a pretty integral part of colonial Connecticut. And again, without these records, we wouldn't have the knowledge without some of their almost like their infighting, right? And that leads to the story that I'm going to tell you today. So just quickly, what you're going to hear about is all thanks to an author named Allegra de Bonaventura, who came to find the diary and took quite an interest in Joshua and his story. And while she's researching early colonial family life, she discovers a man named Adam Jackson. And if you're not familiar with that name, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background today and how Adam came to be featured in our new Black Heritage Trail here in New London. So I hope you will come to check that out if you haven't already. So before we get to that, a little bit about me and how I got involved with all of this and how I came to be here telling you this story today. So Adam Jackson and his family become very important to me and, the way that I came to work at the Hempsted houses and why I'm still here, considering a number of people that look like me were not excited that I worked at the house, not because it was me, but because, they kept the slaves here. And so that was, something that we had to kind of grapple with in the beginning, or at least I did, because it was, pretty intense. But I think it's really important for us to acknowledge our past in order to move on to a better future, and also to be able to have these pretty tough discussions as to why these things are just coming to the forefront and why we're just now able to really heavily acknowledge things that in the past couple of years we really were not able to. So that's something that's, again, really not so far from our memories. People tend to think that, slavery was a really long time ago, and that we can just forget the past or let's stop talking about it. We can't. We really can't. So it's really close to a lot of things that some of us do still experience today. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's silently. So it's important to have these conversations, specifically about people who lived very, very out loud for their time. We don't have space to be silent in a way that they weren't allowed to, right? They didn't have time to do that. So again, a little bit about me. I was invited to a campfire sleepover at the Hempsted houses in June of 2018. And I got to tell you, it was not somewhere that I anticipated being and sleeping over. And I definitely never in my wildest dreams thought that I'd be sleeping at the Hempsted houses. Not at all, especially not in the garret, not a thought. So I'd been in the house before. We used to take field trips there when I was very young. And I hadn't been in the house in a long time, years, in fact, even though my mom had a friend that lived very, very close by, and the house actually right behind the Hempsted houses. But it was just an old closed house as far as I was concerned. And so, I didn't know why anybody would have thought that I wanted to sleep there, but definitely they did. And I'm really glad that I said yes, just like I did for the presentation today. And this is why I'm here. So, invited to that sleepover. There was a man named Joseph Mcgill, who's the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. Now, Joe is from Charleston, South Carolina, and he works at Magnolia Plantation. So he just really started this project where he was going into all these places where the enslaved people had slept, and so that their memory would not been forgotten. So he's been to places like Mount Pillier, George Washington's Mount Vernon, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and a lot of other places where enslaved people had lived and labored. So keep an eye on Joe. If you're not familiar with that project, it is quite national. It's all over the place. So it's really important to follow that. So you won't want to miss some of the things that Joe is doing. And thankfully for me, that's how I got to meet Tammy Denise, who was here, the reason I'm here today, as she portrays Adam Jackson's mother, Joan Jackson. And so at the campfire conversation that night, I talked about slavery in the North and how a lot of people didn't realize that slavery existed outside of the South, or really were not willing to acknowledge that. And we're again still facing some of these challenges where people just don't want to believe that slavery happened here. I think some people really definitely do know that intrinsically, but they don't acknowledge, or they say, oh, it wasn't as harsh as the South. And that's not always true. So again, Connecticut was very, very highly complicit in the transatlantic slave trade. So anyhow, I slept in the house and we had to give feedback on that experience. And it dawned on me that I was generally shielded from these conversations regarding slavery anywhere from a decently young age. I believe that my grandmother, my Nani, always told me that racism and slavery didn't happen here as a means to protect me from something that, shouldn't have been so close to us. So let's get into the story about Joshua Hempsted and talk a little bit about his house. So Joshua Hempsted family comes here to New London about 1645. And although it is widely believed that Joshua's grandfather, Robert, came over with the Winthrop family, it is more probable that he came over from Hempstead, Long Island. Robert is among the first of the 36 grantees to receive land to build on here in colonial Connecticut, which today is our property at 11 Hempstead Street. And he's able to build an early home for his family. So Robert and his wife, Joanne, have 3 children. The first of those children is a daughter named Mary. And Mary holds the distinction of being the first child born in New London. They also have a daughter named Hannah. And finally, they have a son named Joshua. So now you're going to hear the name Joshua a few times. We have Joshua Sr., who was born in June of 1649. Then we have Joshua II, who we refer to heavily. And if you visit the house, we say Joshua the Diarist quite a bit. And then there's a third Joshua, who is the eldest son of Joshua and his wife, Abigail. And then there's one last Joshua that I mentioned. And he's the grandson who is later referred to as Joshua the Sheriff. So anyway, that's a lot of Joshuas. And please don't get me started on the Nathaniels, because there are many of them as well. But one we will talk about here in a little bit. So a little bit about the diary. I think we can advance to the first slide there. Sorry about that. So a little about the diary. It's 700 pages. It was first published in 1901 by the New London County Historical Society, and they acquired it after many years of the diary having remained in the Joshua Hempsted house. Local families such as locals such as early female historian Frances Marion Calkins knew about the diary pretty early on. And Calkins completed and published her own New London history in 1860 after having referenced Joshua's diary to complete, and confirm multiple events that Joshua does write about. And so eventually the diary is divided among the Hempsted family in various locations for safekeeping before eventually being acquired by the New London County Historical Society, who holds the diary today. There's one story that says a disgruntled family member threw a section of the diary in the fire, but we can't be too sure about that. Allegedly, they were upset that they didn't stand to inherit anything, and so they disposed of the diary in a fire. But we, again, are not, too firm on that. It's like one of our little myths there. But we do know that some of the sections are, in fact, missing. And so you can make appointments to go and see the diary and many other New London documents. So the house that you're looking at on the screen is our 1678 Joshua Hempsted house. At the time that Joshua Hempsted is born, and he writes about that in the diary, only the left-hand side of the house that you're looking at would have existed. And the other portion of the house is built on a little bit later. We kind of discussed that time frame a little further in this conversation. But if you look at the right-hand side, of the photograph on your screen, you will notice that the windows are quite different than they would have been, for the older section of the house. And so Joshua is a great source of colonial life in New England and in New London in particular. Joshua even records a trip to Maryland. He documents the Great Awakening and the comings and goings of ships from New London, as well as the publishments or the wedding announcements of the locals and births and deaths as well. So you can see how this document is a gold mine among the locals and a lot of the genealogists. So Joshua keeps this diary for a period of 47 years, from 1711 until 1758, about a month before his death. Of course, Joshua, by the standard of today, was not by any means a particularly wealthy man or a man in, I don't want to say he was not in high standing, because I certainly consider him to be in high standing, but I don't think Joshua viewed himself that way based on some of his writings. But he is in good standing with his community, and he records things like the weather, various accounts of the locals and the work he does around the home and other properties. Joshua also records various court cases throughout the diary. And unfortunately, we don't have the entire diary. And like I said, portions of the manuscript are even missing today. Fun fact, something may be re-added here in the very near future, as something was found at auction. And so we might have some news, but not entire sections, unfortunately. So Joshua the diarist was born in 1678, and we know that because he writes that the diary is completed, or the house is completed in the year of his birth, by his father, Joshua Sr. Joshua Sr. was a wheelwright. And so young Joshua would have known pretty early on what labor was like, what to how to work with, various kinds of wood and what would make good wheels, things like that. So Joshua Hempsted's father, unfortunately, would pass on by the time Joshua was 10 years old. And so he's pretty familiar with death really early on in his life. Unfortunately, that connection with death really does not stop there. And like I mentioned, he does write about, life and death in the diary, but his own family is another story. These are, the recordings. And thankfully for Joshua, we do have these, these things today. So Joshua is a very young man and he's considered to be a very useful friend throughout his life. And him and his services with his various skills end up being very beneficial to many of the locals. Our diarist Joshua is a shipwright, a justice of the peace, a town selectman, a magistrate, a gravestone letter carver, and he is also a farmer. Of course, most people in those days were farmers. It's fairly new land to them, and you would have to, upkeep your property and learn to feed yourself and your family. So Joshua and his wife are married when Joshua is just 18 years old, and his wife Abigail is 20. Together, they end up with 9 children, the last of which is a little girl named Molly. And not long after Molly's born, unfortunately, Joshua's wife Abigail passes away in 1716. Joshua doesn't share very many of these emotions connected to his wife's passing, just writing that my dear wife Abigail died this day. So you can imagine how tragic that would have been for Joshua, as a reasonably younger man. Well, he's a little older at this point, but, in colonial Connecticut and having had all these children, now his wife is gone. Unfortunately, just 5 days later, tragedy would again strike the Hempsted family one more time with the passing of their oldest son, Joshua, after he comes down with fever and a sore throat. So at this point, Joshua is a widowed father, and you have to imagine that he would need some help, as he has this infant baby who needs to be nursed, and he ends up asking for the help of a woman named Miss Truman, and she nurses little Molly until he can find a different alternative. So as I previously mentioned, this author, Allegra de Bonaventura, wrote For Adam's Sake, and what she finds is she initially comes to, do a story about early family life in colonial New England, and she continues to bump up against this name of Adam. But what she finds at this time when she's going through the diary, and something that's very rare for men in colonial Connecticut, is that Joshua Hempsted never chooses to remarry. And that is very unusual. So, and even if the roles were reversed and it was a woman, and her husband had passed on, that would have been, it's just unusual for somebody to not remarry, specifically when they have all these children and a household to maintain. So generally the surviving spouse would marry within a period of about a year, and he just does not. So of course there could be a lot of reasons why Joshua makes this decision, but as he writes, as much as he writes, he never writes down why he chooses not to remarry. I find that pretty interesting that he just kind of leaves that portion of the story out. You would imagine that he would have written that down. At least I wish he would have. So 30 years later, Joshua does make another brief mention of his wife, remembering that my dear Abigail died 30 years ago this day. And so he does not show very many emotions throughout the diary. And that's, sad for us, but it kind of speaks to the times that they just had to do what they had to do and move right along. So throughout this time, Joshua would have had other young women from around town, come and help with the household, because he wouldn't have had time to maintain everything in the household on his own. And not long after, Joshua ends up bringing his younger daughters over to his wife's sisters in Long Island to be cared for until they're a little bit older. Kind of tough to have to, deal with little toddlers or infants and then toddlers. But he can't wait to bring them back because he's such a devoted father. So when he eventually brings one of his daughters back, actually, Joshua is a little bit humorous to me. He weighs her clothing to see how much she's going to cost him. And I find that really comical because he's always weighing things throughout the diary. The things that Joshua is really intense about, So like he's tinkering with his watch. He's at the Winthrops, working on the casement windows, and the windows are giving him a problem. And he's like, well, how much is this going to weigh? And how much is this going to cost me? And, you think about those things today. I'm sure Joshua would not have appreciated this inflation we deal with. And so he is definitely, like I said, good about keeping on top of his money and how much he was spending. But I mentioned he was a very devoted father and always taking time to care for his children when they were ill, and being sure just to be there for them when they were, when needed. But Joshua would need more help around the house as he gets older and had other business outside of the house to attend to. And by this time he's around 38 years old. He's already taken on a more active role in his local community. And there are, plenty of states to settle in, trials to hear. So if we can advance to the next slide, please. So on September 21st of 1727, while preparing the estate of Samuel Fox, who was recently deceased, Joshua would write, I was at Samuel Fox's. I bought Adam for 85 pounds. I paid down and gave a bond for 80 to be paid this day, 12 months in ye interest. 6 days later, Joshua would write, Wednesday, the 27th, fair. Adam is come this morning. It's hard to imagine what must have been going through Adam's head as he moves on to another household, not knowing what his new life would be like. And, after having lived and worked on the Fox family or labored on the Fox family property for so many years. Adam was about 27 years old at this time. And I imagine Joshua would have been somewhat familiar with Adam and the work he did. So economically, this, move makes sense for Joshua. The first time we hear about Adam, however, is in October of 1727, when Joshua writes, Thursday, October 14th, rain in this morning and then fair. Somebody's gone to Joseph Coates again. I was at home in the afternoon, I was summoned to give evidence on Black Adam. So here's kind of where we get into the story of Adam Jackson and his family. And if you're looking at the page on the screen from Joshua's diary, this is about the time that Joshua is making purchase of Adam. So it's a little bit hard to read, and I won't try to read it from there. I've already read it for you from over here. But if you advance to the next slide, it's just more about what Joshua's doing in purchasing Adam Jackson. So we start to talk about Maria, Adam's grandmother. She was enslaved to the Rogers family in New London probably around the 1650s. In the records that Allegra was able to locate, Adam's grandmother is listed as Maria Deaf and Dumb. So it's hard to imagine that what Maria would have gone through as a young girl. And she was very likely unable to communicate with anyone around her. So you have to imagine how terrifying that must have been for a young girl who probably had, some sort of handicaps that she probably wasn't able to communicate with her community. So Maria would go on to have a daughter named Joan around the 1670s. So not so far off around from the time that Joshua was born. So keep that in mind as we go through the story. And both women will remain on the Rogers property for a period of time. Joan is referred to multiple times and multiple references as a mulatto woman. So she was likely a product of rape. And of course, we can't prove, specifically today who fathered her, but there is reference to another Adam Rogers, and the time frames are a little bit off in the Rogers family, but he is also referred to as Adam the mulatto. And so let that thought kind of linger a little bit, because this is, obviously there's some kind of mixed stuff going on over here. And we do know today that there are some descendants of that particular Adam the mulatto, whose name listed it later as Adam Rogers, but it wouldn't be shocking if, there's some correlation between those two things today. Excuse me. So I think we can advance to the next slide. Okay. So that Adam Rogers may possibly somewhere down the line, DNA descendant somewhere closer related to Joan. Again, we don't know. I hope to find out. Because the Rogers would mention later this Adam the mulatto or Adam Rogers and mention to the people not to forget him. So that's something just to keep in the back of your mind and to think about. But 1686 entered John Jackson, who was brought to New London likely from a plantation in the West Indies. And he is eventually sold to John Rogers as a very young man. Now, generally, the enslaved people who were shipped from the North were considered to be of a weaker stature, almost like not fit to work in the fields. But New London, while New London is very close to Rhode Island, two places that were highly complicit in the slave trade. However, John Jackson would very much set out to prove otherwise, that he was not a weak man, but not in most ways that people would imagine, not even today. So what John Jackson does in this time is something you will likely only hear about in a movie today. Such a brave, brave man. So John and Joan Jackson would marry a few short years after John Jackson, comes to New London, while Joan is still in bondage to the Fox family. And within a short time, Joan would give birth to two children, Adam and Miriam. So Adam Jackson was born into chattel slavery around 1700. The same year, his father, John, was able to secure his freedom. And while we're not entirely sure if John was able to purchase his freedom from Rogers or how he came about being a free man, but he does become a free man. But it's, very unusual in a time, definitely not a time where people are setting their enslaved laborers free. And Joan would also gain her freedom in 1703 in a pretty unusual turn of events when the Foxes noted Joan's dutiful service, and they also set her free. Unfortunately, though, due to the laws of those times, Joan would not be permitted to remove her children and take them with her. Instead, she was forced to leave her children behind. And so Adam and Miriam would never again live with their parents, and that's tragedy by itself. I can't imagine today. I can't imagine picking my kids up late from school, let alone having to leave them at somebody else's property and not being able to take them home with me as their parent. And so this, again, it's just hard to imagine, but they would then be considered slaves for life, since the law would follow the order of the mother at the birth of the children. And so unfortunately, she had to leave them alone. Adam at this time was 3 years old and Miriam was just a year old. So this is the plaque that we have for Adam Jackson on the Black Heritage Trail. And I'm very, very proud of the fact that we get to honor Adam in a way that, when you look at the Hempsted houses today, you're not able to see Adam when you just look at the house prior to us having put up this plaque. Now, while we do very much talk about him and have many conversations about Adam Jackson inside the house, this stands as a testament to the bravery that the Jackson family went through and Adam's legacy, and to have something standing to him outside, it makes me very, very, very proud to be able to say that we're honoring him. So, kind of back to this. So even though Joan was forced to leave her children behind, they were able to maintain a bond despite the distance, between the families, something that was more likely common in terms of Northern slavery, probably versus the Southern slavery, when people would be completely sold away and likely never saw their family members ever again. But Joan is able to go back and forth and, across the divide, which is about 4 miles at the time. Doesn't seem like a large gap today, but as, according to the court records, Joan continues to return to see her children and nurse them throughout this time that they're apart. So that is really incredible when you think of, again, how many families were likely sold into slavery otherwise, and unable to maintain any kind of bond for, any length of time. And again, never seeing one another again. That's still today pretty heavy to swallow. Anytime I come across things like that in research, I have to take a step back. I really do. So the Jacksons would go on to have 7 other children despite these circumstances. Adam and Miriam were able, thankfully, to remain together on the Fox family farm until the death of Samuel Fox in 1727. At this time, Miriam is sold to another family around Norwich, and Adam ends up enslaved to Joshua, living on the Hempsted property for a term of 30 years. So although John Jackson was free, he would maintain a close working relationship with John Rogers, having built a home on the Rogers property, and the two would work alongside each other quite frequently. So John and Joan would live together for a period of 10 years in relative peace and prosperity, or as much prosperity as you can imagine at the time, visiting with their children, like I said, as often as they could. But Joan's freedom, however, would be short-lived. So 10 years after Joan gains her freedom, John Jackson and John Rogers would stage a daring rescue of Joan and her youngest children, Jack and Rachel, after they had been sold back into slavery as permitted by law after a pretty lengthy court case. The case goes on for a long number of years, with John litigating in both Connecticut and Massachusetts for the freedom of his wife and youngest children. And they'd had other children while they were living. on that property. The interesting portion of this battle is that there's a case between, separate parts of the Rogers family. Unfortunately for the Jacksons, the not so great side, and who I'm choosing not to name, of that family end up winning that case. And so, alleging that Joan was to be theirs and not to be free, that she was sold away from them. And Joan is about 7 months pregnant at this time. In 1710, this is where, or about 1711, this is where the Hempsted Diary picks itself up. So John Jackson spent time carefully planning this rescue of his family. The two Johns would sail to Long Island, New York, with Joan lying in wait until, John Jackson lying in wait until it was safe to remove Joan and their two youngest children from the residence in which they were enslaved. John Jackson at this point has no money, even as a free man, but he's willing, he's not willing to give up on his family. So the two Johns take a boat late in the evening and they steal Joan and her children back. Now, they know who did this. This is not, I always laugh a little bit at this time in the story because it's, they know exactly who did this because there was all this lengthy court case, right? So they're fighting back and forth over Joan and her children. But Jackson was not given up. After retrieving his wife and children, he hid them throughout various places to keep them safe or to try to maintain their safety. So John Jackson spends the next 7 years fighting for the freedom of his family. And eventually his wife and his children are both sold off into the slave market in Boston. But he continues to fight until eventually he wins their freedom. This is insanely unusual for these times, but to watch a man continue to fight for his family is one of the reasons I continue to learn and tell more about Adam's story. One thing that I don't mention a little bit earlier is that during this 1725 court case, a witness recalled that Adam Jackson was often heard to say, "John and Joan Jackson are my parents." Those were the words that made me stay. As an woman of African-American descent, whose family I'm the family genealogist, one of the family genealogists, and I have to search long and hard to find and maintain our legacy and to put the ties together. And here in the pages of a colonial era legal document, Adam Jackson casts no doubt, not even an ounce of uncertainty from who he comes from. I can't think of anything more beautiful that could come out of something so ugly than to verify your own descendancy for future generations to uncover. That's something to me that was so awe-inspiring. Maybe somebody asked the question, but at this time is not as though Adam is a young child. So of course, anyone asking this question would have likely been familiar with Adam and the Jackson family and the Rogers, specifically because I'm sure this case was the talk of the town. I'm sure they were having multiple conversations about what was going on with these Rogers. And the Rogers were one of the second wealthiest families right behind the Winthrop. So pretty prominent people. And there is, and Allegra de Bonaventura actually gives a lot of good talks about the Rogers family and the story as a whole, because of course she wrote the book. So I'm just telling it from the perspective of what made me stay and what was so important to me. But the Rogers could have a whole story on their own. And in fact, if you pick up the book For Adam's Sake, which I hope you will, they are pretty integral again to the story. But Adam is the reason why we, want to talk more about him. So, again, somebody's probably asking this question, but Adam makes it a point to speak his truth. And to me, that was truly, truly inspiring. So while enslaved at the Hempsted houses, you can advance the slide. I'm sorry, I forgot about the slideshow for you guys. So this is the book For Adam's Sake and the diary of Joshua Hempsted. And to the left of that, if you look, there is a record of the court cases that involved the Jackson family and the Rogers and the Beebes. Years and years of litigation for their own freedom. Insanity. So anyhow, while enslaved at the Hempsted houses, Adam was considered to be a consistent and dutiful worker. He was very skilled in animal husbandry and clearly, in farm work. He was a great farmer. So Joshua never makes any mention of Adam's making any attempt to try to run away, but Adam may have had other ways to show defiance to the fact that he was forced to labor for another man instead of working on his own account. Since Adam was still able to see his family on occasion, it makes sense that he would have maintained his local ties to keep that connection alive. Joshua only makes a few mentions of Adam in a negative light, such as when he complains, and Allegra mentions this in one of her talks, that Adam was nothing today, likely meaning that Adam kind of slacked on his work, and just, that could have been a subtle means of defiance. But we never hear of Adam causing Joshua very, very much trouble through the 30 years that he is made to labor for the Hempsteds. In one portion of the diary, Joshua does write that Adam misses a day of work and is caught by the constable out with his friends. And although Adam was trusted to travel throughout New London and Stonington without a pass, he would still have learned to exercise some caution so that he was not caught out late without the permission of Joshua Hempsted. So on this occasion, Adam waits until the constable falls asleep and he slips away back to the Hempsted houses. And there's not many other instances of trouble mentioned in the diary. I probably would have gotten in a lot of trouble in that time. So, I mean, Adam to me was like the bravery that he exhibits for being able to just remain and, again, tell people who he is. So as far as we know, Adam never marries or has any children. And although there is a small section in Joshua's diary that mentions Negro Adam's child died this day, age 5, this is a few years before Adam lives with the Hempsteds around the time of the court case. And while it's considered by many to be an error, it does spark some curiosity for me about, because remember earlier I mentioned that Adam Rogers, Adam the Mulatto, total age gap there. This Adam would have been of an appropriate age to have maybe fathered a child, but you have to kind of imagine the number of reasons why there's no listed reason that Adam Jackson, we never find out if he marries or not. Nothing that we know of. And so there could have been multiple reasons for that. Maybe the trauma that he and Miriam would have experienced having been stolen away from their family or kept away from their family from a very, very young age. And so you can imagine that, because his other siblings do go on to marry, not all of them, but some of them do go on to marry. Miriam, I believe, ends up married. And so, there could be multiple reasons, but the economic impact of Adam's forced labor, like Lynette said earlier, enables Hempsted to continue to be that useful friend that he is remembered to be. And while Joshua was out taking care of business locally and sometimes further away, Adam is enabling the skills that Joshua's grandsons will use once they're grown, and at some point probably, be able to own Adam themselves. So by this time, Joshua is growing older. And while Adam used to work alongside him, it is now Adam that does the bulk of the labor while Joshua helps. And many of the roads we travel today here in London were paved by the hard work of Joshua and Adam, as noted in the diary. They lay out many of the local roads, marking them for future travel. And in fact, at one point, we are able to see Robert Jacklin was actually one of the other plaques that comes about on the Black Heritage Trail. And it's Adam and Joshua who lay out the road. And, years and years later, myself and my co-researcher, Tom Shook, actually were able to, or Tom actually, pins it down using the diary after we had a discussion. And that's how he ends up finding the property that Jacqueline was on, thanks to Joshua's diary and Adam and Joshua's work. So about 1731, a year after Joan Jackson's death, Joshua hires John Jackson to work alongside his son Adam as a laborer. And although no record exists of what this may have meant to Adam, it is really hard to imagine that the two men wouldn't have enjoyed being able to have that type of time to be in one another's company, as they had been torn apart. And of course, they, again, were able to see each other often, but there's no reasonable explanation for being torn apart from your family and not being able to live, with your parents. By 1734, John Jackson's health was failing, and Joshua Hempsted steps in to be sure that John Rogers Jr. by this time takes care of an ailing John Jackson. So this is due in part to the laws about 1702 that made sure if you freed a slave, they would receive care until the end of their lives. You were not able to just free your slaves and leave them on their own accord. Now, if they were able to hire themselves out maybe and do some work on their own, then that may have been a more reasonable means, but you could not free a slave and just let them flounder. That was not acceptable. And Joshua Hempsted does go up against, the Rogers and make sure that John Jackson is taken care of. So that's pretty interesting. John Jackson would pass away in 1737. So it does come across as odd to me when Joshua, a man who has handled multiple court cases and frequently made sure that the law was upheld for other citizens in London, leaves no instruction as to the care or keeping of Adam Jackson when he dies in 1758. Adam does, though, show up in the estate inventory as an old Negro man named Adam. So without Adam's skilled labor, Joshua Hempsted would have likely had a much more difficult time maintaining his various properties, and caring for his grandsons after his son Nathaniel's death in 1728. And so Joshua does end up raising the grandsons, and without Adam's help, I cannot imagine that he would have had the time to do that on his own. So Hempsted most certainly, again, would not have had much time for his civic duties or to create and maintain that generational wealth that Lynette mentioned earlier. That is something, again, that we are aiming to educate, something I personally am aiming to educate people about. If you drive through New London today, you will notice that there are street names, businesses, old things here that are still some of the names of former enslavers and people who built their generational wealth on the backs of enslaved labor here in colonial Connecticut, coming from Rhode Island and many places locally. And we got to unpack that. We have to unpack that. We have to have these conversations so that we can do better together. So Joshua himself was able to leave his kids some money, a home. Of course, they inherit, somebody inherits the home, and a legacy that we are still discussing today. Something I also did not mention was that the Hempsted family generationally continued to have the house up until and live in the house. Actually, the house was inhabited up until 1937, when the last descendant, Anna Hempsted Branch, lived in the house, and then she passes away, and then the house is then passed to Connecticut Landmarks. So we acquired the house in about 1942, and we've had the care for it since then. So the Hempsteds do go on, and then we also have a stone house on our property. So there's, quite a bit that goes on there. So I am grateful, however, that Joshua did keep these accounts for the research that Allegra did, that we continue to do. We have a Hempsted diary class that I attend every other Monday that we read line by line. It's been 4 years. And I'm grateful for that, because some of the terminology, even though I've been working there, I don't have the energy to try to figure out what it is. And so Joshua, spelling wasn't standardized, and they were kind of just making things up as they went. So it was kind of interesting the way that plays out. But we're really grateful for the records that Joshua Hempsted keeps of Adam's life, because we may have otherwise never known the impact of Adam's life and labor had on the building of New London and the laying out the foundation of the local community. We do know, however, that Adam eventually gains his freedom, showing up on the 1760 tax rolls as a free man, a poor man, but a free one. Next slide, please. No record that we have found currently gives any insight as to how exactly Adam gains his freedom, nor do we have any record of his finding the final resting place of any of the Jacksons today. Up on the screen right now is the webpage for the Black Heritage Trail that was created for Adam Jackson. And these other two pictures that are up here will show up in the next few slides. So if you'd like to advance to the next slide, that would be fine. This is the 1678 garret that was kind of reimagined that Adam Jackson would have slept in. I myself, during that campfire discussion, have slept in that garret. It's okay in June, but I wouldn't recommend it July, August, or any other time of the year. So this is where Adam Jackson likely would have slept. And the Hempsted grandsons would have slept up here too with him, likely at times. It was a working space. But this is what it would have potentially looked like. And so I was going to say, if you'd like to go to the next slide, that's also fine. So he does again show up makes his final appearance in 1764. This is Joshua Hempsted's will. That's where Adam shows up in the estate inventory. And so in 1764, Adam makes his final appearance on the tax rolls, an old man with no more than 2 pounds to his name. Adam may have been freed by one of the Hempstead descendants, or perhaps he purchased his freedom, but we don't know for certain. I'm hopeful to be able to get into the records and find out more, or maybe do a double take and see what some people may not have, found out yet. So it is very likely that Adam died shortly after this last appearance. He would have been 64 years old. So thank you all for being here. I do have some other slides and some other information on the Black Heritage Trail. If we have time for that, we can advance to the next slide, and I will go on to that. And so I'll be keeping an eye on the questions. So that is kind of the story and the legacy of the Jacksons. Of course, that is a very brief, abbreviated story of the Jacksons, kind of the story that we have time to tell in the house when we give one of our tours. So again, please pick up for Adam's sake. There is also a companion book called A Useful Friend that was written by Patricia Schaefer from the New London County Historical Society. It really helps ease in the stories of the diary. Because like I said, it is a tough read. It's 700 pages and there's a lot to it. So up on your screen right now is the story of the Black governors. This is about Florio Hercules. And this is another one of the plaques that is up on Hempsted Street. So as I previously mentioned, the New London's Black Heritage Trail was unveiled in October of 2021. The trail features 15, now 16 sites, one of which Adam Jackson's plaque is involved. And we also have a plaque on the colonial Black governors, which you see on the screen, who among many was a named man Hercules, who was right here in New London. And we consider him to be one of the earliest Black governors. We have not found any earlier evidence of any other Black governors prior to him. But we do have one around 1750 in Hartford named London. And so we're trying to unearth a little bit more about that. So a little bit about them. The Black governors existed starting in the 1740s in Lynn, Massachusetts. And this office goes all the way up to about 1855 locally and ends with a man named Wilson Weston in Seymour, Connecticut. So you have to check that out if you'd like to know more about the Black governors. And I'm sure if you're here, you've been following the Connecticut Freedom Trail for some time, then you maybe have heard about a man named William Lanson. And he was among some of these governors. He played a pretty large role in the building of Long Wharf in New Haven, rebuilding it. Stonemason, he had quite a bit of story. If he hasn't already shown up here, I hope he does. Also, while not directly tied to the New London Black Heritage Trail, he does have a close connection, but I don't really want to spoil that. So I hope that there'll be more about him in the very near future. I have a feeling there might be. The trail also includes stories about Frederick Douglass, who was an early abolitionist. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the name Frederick Douglass. But he comes here to New London, to a place that unfortunately no longer exists, of course, but there is a plaque behind the New London Day newspaper building on what still exists of the former Atlantic Street. And Frederick Douglass did come over a period of months and gave 4 lectures at a place called Dart's Hall. And that's an interesting part of this story is, not long after Frederick Douglass gives his speech is actually not very long at all. Connecticut finally abolishes slavery. And so that's of immense interest to a lot of us here locally in New London. And you would have never imagined if my friend Tom Shook was not digging deep and sharing the stories of amazing Black individuals and all that they did for their community. We are because they were. And the Hempstead abolitionist women also played part in that too. They need their own conversation because incredible women. But while we are discussing my friend Tom, and we can advance to the next slide, I would like to thank Tom for some of the slides that you see put together today. Some of them are my own, but Tom did give me the liberty of using some of these slides from some of the previous presentations, since we are co-researchers on the Black Heritage Trail and other projects here in New London. So special thanks to my friend. Also featured on the Black Heritage Trail is the story of the Amistad and those captives, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with from the Steven Spielberg movie, that tells the story of the captives having gone to New Haven and the ship itself having also gone to New Haven. So I'm sure that's a different story, due to the records that we have here that discuss the Amistad. But not only did it dock here, it stayed here throughout its entire journey. One more thing, and then I'll finish up because I know we're running out of time. But we also recently were able to unveil a plaque for the Middle Passage, the UNESCO Slave Route Site of Memory Project plaque on Amistad Pier, which is right next to the Amistad. And, that was unveiled here recently. We had a couple of the articles out there. I don't want to take up too much time. I do have more stuff to talk about, as I always think I'm not going to have enough time. But thank you all for joining us today. We have those 15 sites, and I really hope that people will run out and, get to know more about it. You can go to visit newlondon.org/Black Heritage Trail to find out more. And you can also visit the Connecticut Landmarks website for more information about our tours at the house. So thank you all so very much for being here.
Well, thank you both, Lynette and Nicole. Very informative. I really appreciate the story of Adam and his parents, especially his parents, John and Joan, because, again, we don't hear those positive stories. And I like to call John a superhero of the colonial ages because of his fierce determination to not only keep his family together, but the lengths that he went through to keep them together. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments section. And don't forget to do the survey. I forgot to mention it earlier, but please do the survey letting us know what you would like to hear or any comments. We did have a question. They wanted to know, besides the court papers and the diary, what else was used as research material?
So for me, I definitely delved back and forth, and I kind of keep my head in for Adam's sake. It is a family saga. This is my very well used copy. As you can see, I have notes everywhere by Allegra di Bonaventura. She has plenty of talks. She is really phenomenal. She did really great research. And there's also another book called A Useful Friend, and it is a companion guide to the diary. It was done in 2008 by Patricia Schaefer from the New London County Historical Society. And so again, it does detail, it goes through the conversation of the Rogers, who they were, the Livingstons, the Levine money, all of these things that are integral to the stories of New London. And so I was able to use a lot of that and a lot of the records that we have from just working at the Hempsted houses and things that were documented and things that were written down, even going back to the Anna Hempsted branch, the 1937 last surviving Hempsted to live in the house. She wrote letters back and forth about the importance of her family and some of the things that Joshua wrote in the diary, even dating the house back to 1644. So the foundation of the home, and so it's like the story comes from like the ground up, and it just keeps, there's more to find out.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. Well, we have time for a couple more questions. In regards to the Rogerines, do you have much information on them? Because I know that at one point they were sort of like considered a fanatical type people. But what can you tell us about the Rogerines?
Yeah, so they were considered quite fanatical. And so like the Rogerines it was more of a family sect, like more of a family religion. John Rogers was the son of James Rogers, and he ends up in Rhode Island, traveling back and forth for his father, who was a commercial baker in the 1650s. And he ends up kind of getting enthralled in all these things that integrally are Rhode Island, because Rhode Island has all these different religions going on. And so he comes back and he forms his own sect. Joshua Hempsted in the diary refers to them as the Quakers still. And that's there's actually a section of Waterford today up by where they lived is called Quaker Hill. I'm sure John Rogers wouldn't be too proud of that. He probably wants it to be called Rogers Hill or something. But they were interesting. And one thing I do want to point out about the Rogers, while they did have that going on, and while there was a lot going on throughout the family, John Rogers and his sister Bathsheba were actually two of the people who in the beginning they were like, this slavery stuff is kind of wrong. Like but they did some silly things. And John Jackson was among them. Like, they were accused of burning down one of the meeting houses, daubing feces on, the Stonington meeting house, I think. And they were doing some pretty fanatical stuff. As Sabbatarians, they would go up to the local churches and while they were in service, and John Rogers would run around with a barrel of shoes and try to sell them when he knew that was not okay to do. So they're interesting. They're very interesting. So there are narratives of the family out there. They have a long line of descendants. And so I'd like to see them kind of get involved with the story of Adam and help us maybe trace some of the things that are in the background, because there's DNA now. We have the access to those things, right? And that's something that I've really wanted to pick up on. it's possible that Joan herself was a Rogers, and I wouldn't doubt that. So, people aren't maybe ready for that conversation yet, but we got to get there, because I think we'll be better together. That's how we heal, is by confronting the dark history of the legacy of slavery in our past.
I agree. There's no such thing as a difficult conversation, only uncomfortable ones. And this is an uncomfortable conversation that needs to be had. We have time for just one more question. It wants to know, what happened to Adam's siblings and their children? Do we have any information on them?
So we do know that some of the siblings actually do end up married. Some remain enslaved, and the other children. So some of them were born when Joan was free, and so they are on to do some other things with their lives. We know Miriam ends up marrying, and I believe Miriam does have children, but we do not and have not traced or tracked any of the descendants today. I am hot on the trail. I'm trying to get there. That's something I'm looking forward to doing, and looking at different grant fundings and things in ways that we can get that story told and maybe find them, because they have to be out there. They have to be out there. But, I just want to say that it is all in for Adam's sake. Not all of it, but, a good majority of it. So I really hope you enjoyed what we've presented here today. And I hope you will come visit us to hear more about Adam and his legacy in Connecticut. He really is very important to me.
Well, thank you so very much, Lynette and Nicole, for sharing your expertise with us and giving us all of this great information. I hope that our audience will come and visit the New London Hempsted houses, because it is a fabulous place to visit, and to just be on the grounds. You do get to feel that something beautiful happened there, a great story. The history is there. And although part of it is tragic, it is a part of the fabric of the community. So thank you both so very much for joining us. And we hope that you will come back. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us. Please fill out the surveys. And again, we will be back on the 4th Tuesday of September, where we will have a conversation about the Beeman Triangle out of Middletown with Jesse Nafta. So please join us again. And also, we will have another one, Discover the Legacy of James L. Smith, October 25th. For September, it is Tuesday, September 27th at noon. Again, I am Tammy Denise. Thank you so very much for joining us on the Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Until next time.